My name is Sarah O'Toole. I'm the CEO with CBM Ireland. We're a disability NGO. We had a really interesting discussion at our table, and I think I've tried to capture three things. You can count them and see if they're three. I don't know. I haven't put numbers beside them. A key part, we thought, is the importance of support systems. So not only at times of response, but also in times of preparedness. So kind of the nexus of development and humanitarian work. And of course the importance of voices of women, when we talk about it, it's also about their willingness to respond and in which capacity they wish to be part of a response. So instead of, sometimes if we identify, say, a strong women-led or feminist organisation, we tend then to dump everything, say, okay, you could do this, you could do that. And there was the example of the lady in Nepal who had lost her family, had lost everything, but then it's important that you don't crowd too much on that person. You think they're going to be a valuable leader, that they have the necessary supports to do that, and that they are comfortable in doing that and give them that capacity. We talked about the challenges around the current infrastructure. One of the speakers spoke about the current cluster, how clusters are organised, and where you have different tiers and layers of involvement, where the funders are really at the central part and have the main seats at that table, and that others cannot come into that, and so someone actually maybe steps aside and allows someone in to that kind of central discussion. We talked about the importance of selection of partners, and that if we want change to happen and to hand over this power, we need to select partners who are feminist in their nature, not necessarily women-led organisations, but where the organising itself is feminist focus, and the importance of money, that finance has to go to these organisations, and not just about a kind of a tokenism around inclusion, but where money actually talks in these situations. And finally, the importance of counting, that if you don't count people, they don't count. So at all levels of kind of design and implementation, where we are measuring the qualitative and quantitative nature of what we're trying to do, and the importance of having gender as the main focus of that. So I think I captured everything.
Yeah.
There you go.
I'm Deirdre, I'm from Troker, and on our team we had Self-Help, ActionAid and Troker. So we had the one around disaster risk reduction, also kind of looking at before the emergency happens, are we investing in local partners, women-led organisations as part of a kind of core pillar of our disaster risk reduction programmes. And we liked how earlier they were talking about the development humanitarian nexus rather than the humanitarian development, so that's where we linked that one in with. We also talked about our commitment in an emergency response to looking at, again, it's linked to the partnership, identifying those partners, but often in an emergency response, if you don't have the partners there already and you're starting a response and you're just looking for women-led organisations, an additional investment is needed there, whether, you know, some context there may not be appropriate humanitarian or women-led organisations that have the capacity. So it's about identifying potential ones that exist, maybe need capacity building or support, or looking at innovative ways to engage women-centred organisations, but making sure that trying to bring in a minimum in your response. And, you know, as different, the organisations that we were in our group were all partnership organisations, so we were like, that would be different for direct implementation organisations. Potentially it would be more around staffing, but as partnership organisations, identifying a minimum number of either women's centre or women's led, and providing that support and investment in the longer term. And then we had another one on doing some research on how to ensure women's leadership and participation in humanitarian response, maybe looking at some different, because it's all contextualised, everything has to be contextually based, but it may be taking some sample countries and learning from the localisation research that Troker did, maybe, you know, ensuring that that's localised, that there's actually maybe local staff or local representatives in designing that research, which would kind of give a more of authenticity to it. as well, and then to come out with concrete recommendations, and then maybe a pilot phase where you actually apply those recommendations to see how effective and what works. And then we had a fourth one which linked to yours, which was around financing. You have to finance the risks and women's participation, whether it's childcare or what services or supports need to be put in place to support that process.
Fiona Shanahan from Trocra, and we had Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, the Irish Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam. There's a lot of overlap. I suppose to begin with, we looked at kind of the assumptions in the question a little bit. So around, are we ready to hand over power? And is there a conversation yet to be had about some of that? And I know that conversation is ongoing. And also leadership. Are we talking about visibility, the presence of women-led organisations in our spaces? Or are we talking about leadership in terms of technical control and complete technical control of their own programming? So 3 of the things that we talked about, again, the emergency preparedness, the development humanitarian nexus, looking at women-led organisations, but also which women, and intersectionality in our approach there. So issues around ethnicity, social class, privilege in that context, and how connected particular women are to particularly vulnerable and marginalised women who are affected by a humanitarian crisis. So looking at intersectionality in development or emergency preparedness context to prepare us for when we're responding with these women-led organisations. The second point we talked about, and again, financing gender isn't free. And this idea, Siobhan made a really interesting point about how for a long time within gender and GBV and sometimes protection, psychosocial support more generally, we make a big point of how cost effective it is, how small it is, how this doesn't require a huge amount of funding. This doesn't necessarily require standalone programs. It's just doing what you do differently and all of that. But actually it does. It requires significant funding. It requires this is very human resource intensive work, and we need to adequately resource the aspects that we're talking about. For women-led organisations, that will be around HR policies, childcare, issues around security, the accommodating measures that make it possible for women humanitarians to do their work, particularly things like psychosocial support, staff care and supervision, clinical supervision. Many of the women-led organisations that we work with are refugees themselves responding in their own communities, and how can we make it possible for them to do that, and to do that in a sustainable way and to stay in humanitarian. The third issue that we looked at, again, development and humanitarian, but also kind of more broadly, are we viewing this purely through the lens of our programming and our partners, or are we looking at wider kind of systems level approaches? For example, approaches that look at micro, meso, macro levels around local government, ministries, departments and agencies, gender mainstreaming, but also standalone humanitarian programming within those contexts. And also the example of, say, for example, the ICRC's work on integrating sexual and gender-based violence response within national disaster management organisations' laws and policies. So looking at that kind of more structural level around sexual violence response and how to have that in a wider systems approach rather than purely through international NGOs. Lastly, on GBV, we had a discussion around the importance of not having a one-size-fits-all approach, and particularly in terms of gender-based violence in emergencies, sometimes very short interventions, low-quality interventions, or interventions where a lot of pressure is put on local partners to achieve, a very beneficiary-oriented approach in a very short space of time. And we also talked about the fundamental kind of shared understanding of gender-based violence and a feminist approach to that, and how that cross-cuts, multiple countries and contexts, but then the need for a contextual approach specific to the context, and supporting women-led organisations to take leadership in designing those approaches. Thank you.
In our table, we had different organizations represented. We had Concern, we had Irish Consortium, we had Christian Aid, we had World Vision, we had Action Aid, and we had a student from Queen's University. My name is Salome Mbugua. I'm a PhD student at Trinity College, researching on integrating women in peace building in Democratic Republic of Congo and focusing on Goma. We came up with many points, but actually I have 3. And the very first point that we really spoke about was on the underlying issue, or what we should actually be talking about, even before we go to putting women into leadership. And it's addressing the whole issue of the social norms. And this is actually by engaging men. because we are leaving men out, and most of the time, actually, men and boys, most of the time, they are the problem of allowing women to take up the leadership. So we said we have to recognize that underlying factor. And when we are addressing gender relations of power or dynamics of power, that we have to understand that, there are social norms that still prevent women from taking up those leadership. And I actually mentioned about my research and my scoping study in Democratic Republic of Congo, where I met with the head of policy with the Ministry of Women and Children. And he said that they have the very best policies in Congo. And all the international NGOs are there, you know them. But the problem is, actually the problem is on the ground. And this is actually the men. So they're the social constraint where men don't want to be addressed by women, where they don't want to put women into levels of decision making, when they don't want to see women standing or being involved in that table of leadership. So really, the underlying factor, if we want to address this and not to becoming again talking about it, it's really engaging men and boys on equal foot about issues of gender equality, and that it's about understanding issues of gender roles and norms and how they impact on the participation of women or women taking up leadership. The second point that we came up with is the whole area of capacity building. And this is actually if we are going to put women into the level of leadership. Here, we said that, there are women, and for example, in all the areas that we are talking about, there are women who are involved in groups or organizations. But if we are talking truly about women leadership, because we have two different of women. We have women who are brought into meetings and into the table as a recipient of the information that is going to be delivered to them. So they are on the agenda, but they are actually not talking, or they are not involved in decision making. But here we are talking about leadership. So how can we ensure that we have the best women on the table, or we have women who will make proper contributions? Here we said that the women capacity needs to be built. And how we can do it as organizations, we already have contacts on the ground, we are assuming. So we can actually try to work with those NGOs and organizations on the ground to help us identify the women who can, be able to articulate issues and communicate in levels of leadership. And then we facilitate them with the training, capacity building training, to enable them to engage. We spoke again here, and I gave an example of Goma, where we have women who are involved in peace building at the grassroots level. But you will find that if we come to the regional and national level, they are not there. Why? Because they are only actually around there because most of them are involved in small organizations and they feel comfortable talking at the organizational level, but moving beyond that, it's difficult. When you go to regional and national, you find that, it's a woman whose husband is the pastor or, his head somewhere who has been brought, on the table just actually to tick a box that there was a woman. So we said that, we need to be able to facilitate the capacity of these women at the grassroots level to be able to come up all the way. Whether they are women who are looked down upon in the community, that they are single mothers, or they are women who are not, they are nothing, they felt like they're nothing in the society, that we can bring them up. So we said that will be very important to build that actual capacity. And then the very final one, we spoke about building in the needs of the women. So it's actually building the funds need. Here we spoke about how us as international NGOs and NGOs on the ground do not want to understand the needs of the women on the ground. And actually I saw it on the report that Rachel spoke about, how one of the women actually expressed her concern that the NGOs are expecting women to participate and to be part of what they are doing. But they don't consider that they have needs, family needs. Here we spoke that, we have to take into account that there are women who don't have maybe other sources of income. There might be barriers that are impacting on their participation, whether they are, childcare, travel, or allowance even to be able to provide food on the table. We said you may not even call it childcare and transport, but at least an allowance to enable that woman to participate fully. Otherwise, if you don't do that, this will be actually very difficult to be able to engage that woman and to put her into a leadership position because you're also not considering her needs. So we say that we should also invest on human resources policy and really work meaningfully on how we can support the woman to be able to give the best leadership on the ground. Thank you.
I'm Hajar from, the UCD Masters class here. I know we had a diverse group of people. We also have one of our PhD students from the UCD Humanitarian Action Institute as well. So we discussed quite a few things, and a lot of things did actually come up. So I won't repeat actually some of the different issues, but we did talk about communication in response. So we were talking about a more grassroots field kind of level. So as we get in there, when we're in an emergency, what do we do, or what do we try to implement even just before any kind of emergency hits? So we were talking about local actors. In terms of local actors, we looked at local women leaders, a bit like what Rachel said in terms of faith leaders or faith women leaders who would actually influence communities, who would be, you know, the lady who holds the tea party, as was suggested. So to make sure that we have an open dialogue of people and a community leader who is present, who knows the cultural issues. Also, we talked about mediators. So we're talking about mediators from a local perspective and an INGO Western perspective. So somebody maybe who looks like me, for example, if you look at the Middle East, a European youth with a Middle Eastern twist who speaks Arabic, for example, if you're going into Syria. So somebody who can speak the language of both, or has both sides of the coin and understanding as well. So we talked about mediators that are prepared on an international and a local level. There was a lot of talk actually about mediators and being in touch with the situation and cultural expertise. We also talked about soft power versus hard power, where we were talking about actually some agencies just going into tick boxes, quite frankly, but maybe we should get that, you know, women, you know, leadership role as an extra tick box on the list of tick boxes. Sorry for the tick boxes there. And then as well, we talked about local resources, how we're supporting women, you know, women with children, maybe, I don't know, and such similar, you know, similar to what's already been said. I think that's pretty much it. So, thank you.
In our group, we had Goal, Concern, Vita, Irish Red Cross, and Irish Aid representatives. And actually, a lot of I'm the last person, so a lot of what has already been touched upon, we touched upon in our group as well.
And you are?
Irish Red Cross, Gillian. Yeah. So just to summarise, some of the key points that came up in our discussion, that came up in other discussions as well. Even though it says emergency response, on the question we looked back a little bit, and we talked about more like a disaster risk reduction approach. So the idea is that you already, prior to the emergency breaking out, you already should have a good understanding of the underlying systems, like culture, religion, education, knowledge, etc., that can prevent women's leadership or even participation in some contexts. That a lot of that knowledge should come from local partners that you trust. And then there was the idea as well that often local partners might put you in contact with like a women's group or organisation, but you would have to be very aware that might be the elite. And that might be, the example of Ethiopia came up, where you might have a women's group and the women's representative from Addis Ababa, and when she goes to somewhere in the rural area, for the local women, talking to her is as alien as talking to someone from Ireland, say. So that you have to be very careful about which women's voices are being heard and not just the elites. The idea was to look at DRR and preparedness, so that women's involvements in community consultations and decision-making processes are already being established prior to the emergency breaking out. And then in terms of the project cycle, that ensuring that women's participation is throughout any sort of humanitarian intervention, and that often the way to ensure that happens is to work firstly with the men and boys perhaps in a community. That issue came up as well, that it's not always easy to tap immediately into the women's, to hear women's voices. And then finally, to summarise, we talked a little bit about the HR issue as well, and that there should be sort of gender quotas for women in leadership positions, and then you have to look at what's stopping that now, like childcare and different family needs and structures that might prevent women from actually holding leadership positions in NGOs. That's kind of it.